As an African American born into slavery, nobody would have suspected this man would grow up to be one of the greatest public speakers of all time. In this episode, we discuss the life and achievements of an abolitionist, a politician, and most importantly, a free black man in 19th century America, as we ask, who is Frederick Douglass? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining us from the faculty is Dr. Rebecca Fraser, a historian of 19th century America with a particular interest in the history of African Americans, especially relating to their resistance against slavery and the enslaved experience. Welcome back, Rebecca.
Hello, nice to be back.
Yep, great to have you on this. And we're also joined by Tony Phillips, a former undergraduate in American Studies at UEA. He forged a career as a documentary maker at the BBC, later becoming a commissioning editor at BBC World Service and Radio 4. He was also Vice President of Content at WNYC Studios in New York, and he's currently the exec producer on Every Voice with Terence McKnight for WQXR. That's a lot of letters. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to have you join us for this.
A pleasure.
And, you know, Frederick Douglass is a name that comes up a lot amongst anyone that has discussed or studied American studies. So I think it's really important that, you know, earlier on in this podcast journey that we're taking our listeners on, that we really dive into who Frederick Douglass is and the impact that he's had. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about his life as a slave and understand his backstory a bit more. So, Rebecca, I wonder if you could shine a bit of light on that.
Yeah. So Douglass, where do we start? I mean, so Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, right? So he was born in around 1818. But obviously, with enslaved peoples, there's very little record unless enslavers develop an inventory of enslaved peoples born on their particular plantations, listing, you know, sort of their age, their value, and such like. So it's a bit hazy as to, you know, sort of exactly when he was born. But he was born into slavery, and he was born to an enslaved woman, Harriet Bailey. And the rumor was that his father was a white man. The rumor was that his father was his mother's master, right, enslaver. Harriet Bailey was sold very soon after Frederick's birth, when he was just a toddler. So they were separated, and this happened, you know, sort of constantly in the systems of slavery, in terms of profit, in terms of enslavers seeking increased profit from their enslaved chattel. So he only got to see his mother once every kind of few weeks, if that. He was raised by his grandmother, and this is particularly usual in these circumstances. I mean, Harriet Jacobs, another enslaved woman who was famed among the abolitionists, she was also raised by her grandmother after the death of her mother and father, and so, you know, sort of it's very usual for these extended family networks to raise enslaved children when parents are sold away or they're orphaned because of death. So yeah, and his life as an enslaved person was pretty typical. I think he was sold to various enslavers and hired out as well to various white peoples to work for them, and I think what really motivated the turning points to make him really determined to escape enslavement, I think, are three particular moments. His witnessing of Aunt Hester being whipped just brutally by her enslaver for daring to go and see her lover So a man that she was, so he was enslaved as well, going and seeing her lover, and the enslaver was enraged by this, and Frederick Douglass, the young Frederick Douglass, at around 7 years old, witnesses this, and Aunt Hester is stripped and whipped within, sort of an inch of her life, and he explains this as a kind of the blood-stained gate of slavery. I mean, this is just horrific for a 7-year-old to witness, to be, sort of a voyeur, really, secretively watching. I mean, the enslaver doesn't know that he's watching. And then I think he's sold to the Olds in Baltimore. And Sophia Old, his mistress, teaches him to read. She begins to teach him to read. And this changes Frederick Douglass's life. Her husband, his master, Colonel Old, instructs Sophia to stop. Knowledge is dangerous for enslaved peoples to acquire. So she does stop teaching him to read, but he learns by bribing the local white schoolboys with bread. So he gives them bread, which is, sort of available from the cook's kitchen, and they teach him to read. They teach him his letters. Frederick attributes his escape and his knowledge of, sort of freedom to literacy. And it's a campaign that is lifelong in terms of bettering oneself through education. It's phenomenal. And then, of course, there's the fight with Covey, which is just fundamental. So Covey was what is known in the 19th century as a slave breaker. So he's a poor white man. He hires Frederick at the age of about 16 and seeks to break Frederick in very, very brutal punishment. And Frederick Douglass says in his narrative, you now see a man become a brute, right? He is so worn down by this, sort of breaking of by Covey, but then he fights back. The one time he sort of musters the kind of courage and the strength to actually, sort of fight back. And he then says, sort of, you see a slave being made a man. So masculinity is key to all of this, and that's a whole other discussion, right? And I think those were the three central kind of moments which cumulatively encouraged and turned Frederick's ire towards this isn't the way people should be treated. Let's try for an escape, and then he does successfully.
And in preparation for this podcast, I've been rereading the first of several of Douglass's autobiographies, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. I'll put it in the show notes for anyone who's interested. One of the things that's in that I found really interesting was how much he was kind of wrestling with the burden of intellect, of understanding the position of slavery and understanding why it's such a wrong. And so, Tony, I wonder if you could speak a bit on that fight for freedom and on the sort of that journey that Frederick went on to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I came across Douglass primarily as a student, as you said in your introduction, but I don't really recall it being a kind of deep immersion into Douglass. I remember kind of coming across him a little bit, but it was really when I left and went to the BBC and started to make documentaries that I really kind of felt, oh, I think I've missed something here. This guy is so significant, and I therefore pitched an idea to tell the story as much as I could of Douglass. And it was just interesting, even that question that you raised at the very beginning about his origins. In the first narrative, he starts by saying, "I was born," and I always felt. I remember reading that. This is in the early 1990s. I remember reading that over and over again, thinking this is just so painful because although he was born there, if you like, in body, I didn't feel that he was both in America but not of America. He was like millions of other people transported there, historically, brought there. And there's a connection between my own personal interest and my own personal experience. We came effectively our families took a very similar route from the west coast of Africa through to the Caribbean and then up to what is now the United States. So in my documentary, I started the story actually on the west coast of Africa in Ghana, what is now known as Ghana. And I kind of took license and rooted Douglass there, or his descendants there. And so I wanted to paint that journey that he wasn't really from Talbot County. He was, but he wasn't. And the African American experience for me as a student was always about looking a bit deeper beneath the surface. That, yes, he became an enslaved person, but he was fundamentally a person first and always was a person. And so I wanted to challenge that notion of him and millions of others, my own relatives in the Caribbean, challenge that notion of us being seen as white men and white women of those in those times saw us. And so as Becky just pointed out, I mean, you've got this extraordinary individual who pulls on these resources to kind of trade bread for literacy and stand up to these violent slave breaker men. I mean, you've got an extraordinary character there. And I was just intoxicated by him as a sort of audio storyteller to try and map some of this stuff and to try and map some of the extraordinary journeys he went on. And it was the literacy bit that I focused quite heavily on. I think he was told, and I can't remember where, you'd probably remember better than I would, Becky, that where was it that he was told that literacy would make him unfit to be a slave? Was that the Baltimore master?
Yeah, so that was Colonel Old.
Right.
I think it was Colonel, but it's certainly Master Old. And so he has Master Old, when he catches Sophia teaching Frederick to read, Master Old says teaching him will, make him unfit to be a slave. Well, of course it would, yeah,
right.
Because he'd know that slavery is just wrong, yeah. Right?
But yeah, and so what I found really mesmerizing as I was rereading as well over the last couple of days in preparation for today, I'd forgotten just how much it reads like just like an amazing piece of journalism that it is, when he says in that first narrative, An American Slave, written by himself, he says he doesn't, he speaks a lot about literacy and that journey that he took to learn his ABCs and the rest of it. But what I'd forgotten about was how much he kind of didn't tell. It wasn't a tell-all about how he did it, because he was fully aware that there were thousands of others around him that he knew, that he didn't want to lift the lid on how he did it exactly. He wanted to keep some of that back, but he wanted to impress upon the reader, listen, you've just got to believe me. I can't tell you everything because it will put their lives in jeopardy and their plans for their own escape. It would perhaps damage their attempts for their own escapes to freedom. But just go with me, please. Just trust me on this. And so I love the idea that he didn't tell everything.
It's like that with so many narratives written by enslaved peoples in America, sort of, and I keep coming back to her, but, Harriet Jacobs, she writes under a pseudonym. So she's Linda Brent. And, and it wasn't until years later that the research was done that actually they could map the pseudonym she'd given everybody in her narrative onto the realities and the historical situations. And of course, she couldn't out certain people as well. It just, and again and again and again, we find this. So it's, just trust me on this, as Tony has said, but actually I can't reveal everything because if I do, then those peoples who, have helped me maybe criminalize themselves or, sort of punish themselves. So this is a life actually that I don't think 21st century audiences would really, really understand having to kind of live your life in two ways. It just, sort of, so, in secret in a way. So yeah, it's just, and I've read the narrative again over the past few days, and I was just inspired again. It's amazing. I mean, sort of, so yeah.
I spent time when I was making the documentary with a Douglass biographer called William McFeely. And I can't remember the name of the biographer, but William McFeely wrote a fantastic biography. And his book and name is probably worth putting on your list as well. But Bill McFeely, when I asked him if he would do this, he said, yeah, sure, I'm very happy to talk to you about Douglass. Where do you want to talk? I said, where do you want to meet? And I think he was based in Athens, Georgia. And he said, well, to be honest, there are so many places, but one of the most significant places is to go to Nantucket. So I went, I then did a bit more reading, and Bill told me that Nantucket was the place that soon after escaping to the north, Douglass was, of course, taken up by various abolitionists and protected, and he got married quite quickly as well. But he then kind of hit the road with the abolitionists as a public speaker. And where Bill took me was to this amazing church, which still stands, where Douglass spoke. And it was one of his first main sort of public events. And he was quite nervous. I remember Bill explaining that Douglass was nervous. Douglass was quite apprehensive. And I think he used the expression, allow me to speak plainly. He was very nervous and he was kind of quaking in his boots. But then he started to speak and he gained a little confidence as the audience was responding to him explaining and describing his time as an enslaved person. And therefore, it kind of gave him the courage. He didn't stop telling his story for pretty much the rest of his life. But it was wonderful to be kind of taken there, almost walking in his footsteps up into the church and to the pew, perhaps, where Douglass would have sat, and you can see where he would have stood at the lectern. But it was, it's just that journey of freedom, at least psychologically for him, through speaking his story. And then, of course, I was gripped by Douglass coming to Britain, which is essentially where he legally became free. That was something that I hadn't really figured out. I kind of learned on the way, but there were two women in particular, I think they were sisters, Emma and Anna, I think, Richardson, I think they may have been from Newcastle. They were abolitionists in Britain, and they raised money, approximately £150, to be sent back to his owner, to his master, Thomas Old, to buy his freedom. It caused some consternation because there were some abolitionists in Britain who were saying, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't take that money because that means you're playing along. You agree in some way with the institution of slavery, and you shouldn't do this. You should reject this. And Douglass had to explain, listen, when I go back to America, they can slap me in chains. They can send me back down south. They can make me a slave again because legally I am still somebody else's property. So I need to do this. I hear what you're saying, but I need this. I need this legal bit of paper.
And, as we've touched on, that abolitionist movement was in full swing, even at the time that Frederick Douglass found his freedom. But Tony, how important do you think it is that former slaves like Frederick are standing and speaking and telling their story, through, the written word in their autobiographies, but also, standing up and speaking? What did that do for the movement?
I think it was essential. It was absolutely critical. And especially when you can get people as articulate and as persuasive as Douglass, I think it was central. But I think it's also really important to know that, Douglass was in a continuum. There were others who came before him, and there were many who came afterwards. And in fact, there's a whole literary tradition of African Americans who are just telling their story, speaking their truth, as it were, from, Ida B. Wells. And there are so many. Douglass is in that tradition. And I think he really needs to be seen in that light rather than the one and only. I mean, he was a singularly influential individual, and but he was in this continuum that we still see today, right through from Dr. King, James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. There are many, Malcolm X. There are so many who are in that tradition of speaking, whether it's in literary form, in a play, in song, or in speeches like Douglass and co would have been doing. It in so many ways defines a kind of African American literary and historical tradition.
I think as well, I love this idea of speaking truth to power, and it's really important that Frederick Douglass was enslaved, right? So it's not just like he's a free black man and he's talking about sort of the injustice of slavery. He's lived it, right? And hundreds of other enslaved peoples who escape from the South and also, sort of slavery existed in the North. So we have enslaved women and men. I'm thinking about Sojourner Truth, who was enslaved in New York. They write their narratives too. But Douglass and Frederick Douglass and others who were enslaved and escaped, they lived slavery. Their experiences were not just imagine what it's like. They could tell what it was like, and they couldn't tell, as we said earlier, the whole truth, because you're pitching to an audience that is perhaps of a particular class, i.e. middle class, who are offended by sort of the kind of grotesque brutalities of slavery and aspects of slavery, such as rape, brutal whippings, etc. So there were limits to what they could say, but Frederick Douglass stood on the stages, the platforms of abolition, told his truth, but also just questioned what America was doing, right? So this wasn't just, sort of listen to my story, I'm so, sort of pity me. He was absolutely furious with America. Your history is a sham, right? So the 4th of July, sort of what does the 4th of July mean to the slave? I think most iconic speech of the 19th century, made on the 5th of July, Rochester, Corinthian Hall, and he absolutely just lambasts America for this sham of a festival. Where's the independence for enslaved peoples, right? Yeah. And so for this articulate, wonderful, eloquent man, black man, to stand on the platform of abolition, and not only say, that, sort of being enslaved is wrong in terms of the rights of humanity, in terms of social justice, but also America. But look at you. What kind of history is that? He calls them barbarians. He calls it barbaric. Yeah. And so, to stand up and say, and this is a man that claims, and was, so he claims an identity as an American. He wasn't, I'm, sort of my origins are African and I'm adamant that I'm going to go back to Africa. And he was very, very conscientious about all the time, I'm African American, right? I deserve the rights of an American. And I think that's essential for the way in which we think about Frederick Douglass, and we think about black abolitionists, because Tony's right. This wasn't just, sort of Frederick Douglass on his own, sort of leading the charge. There were so many more black abolitionists of the kind of pre-Civil War era that, sort of stood up on that stage and, on the platform of abolition, and, sort of spoke their truths to power as well. Which is essential, and it's a real kind of testimony to their activism and intellect, actually, that by 1861 the Civil War had erupted and and slavery was eventually abolished after 4 years of cataclysmic conflict. So and that is due in most part to enslaved people's efforts. Right, so I think we really need to sort of stress that.
I was very lucky to have met, around the time I was making this Douglass documentary, I met the widow of Malcolm X, and Betty Shabazz was doing the rounds at that time. As much of her later life, she used to go and talk to students a lot. And she used to, I think she told me one occasion she was at Harvard, and she said she read this quote, and she said something like, well, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival. Who said that? And they'd all shout, Malcolm. And she'd say, no, Frederick Douglass. And so the links between, how history kind of contracts and then stretches out again, the links between Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass, or even James Baldwin. If you go online and watch James Baldwin's speech in the Cambridge Union, I think that was 1963. One of the things, by the way, that Baldwin says is, I picked the cotton. I went to market. I mean, it's just like, hold on a minute. You? Of course, there's an identification there historically with the time of Douglass and beyond. So that link, that connection between Douglass and all the others of his time right through to today, it's rock solid. Disturbingly rock solid, because it appears that the United States and other countries are still struggling to come to terms with concepts of diversity and equity and inclusion. And there's still an awful lot we can learn from Douglass and from what he was saying, from what he was articulating as a need for America to kind of grow into the nation that it always wanted to be. So there's still a lot for us to learn from people like Douglass.
Mm-hmm. And I do think as well that Frederick Douglass and other Black abolitionists of the pre-Civil War era, so sort of first half of the 19th century, they provide a model. They provide a model for other Black activists, from Ida B. Wells to Marcus Garvey to Martin Luther King to, Malcolm X. They're the model, right? This is not just, and so many of my students don't really know who Frederick Douglass is. And if you want to know why Black Lives Matter is the biggest campaign in the 21st century US, is because of men like Frederick Douglass, who provided that, model of how you become that social champion for activism, for change, for social justice, for racial equality. And it was needed then because of slavery, racial slavery, but it's also needed now for the shooting of unarmed Black men and women at the hands of the police and racial abuse and such like. So, but it's where Frederick Douglass and other Black abolitionists is where it began, and the fact that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in 19th century America, hundreds of pictures were taken of him, and this is because Frederick Douglass realized the image mattered.
Yeah,
it was important to sort of show that African Americans could be dignified, could be respectable, but it wasn't just that they could, could articulate well, or because of their intellect. It was because of the way they looked, right? So, and Douglass, no one can deny, his pictures are absolutely a thing of beauty, and he takes them all through his life, from a young man to, I think he died at the age of 85 or something. So, all through his life. I mean, Henry Louis Gates calls him, if he was alive today, Douglass would be like a social media influencer, the best social media influencer, because he knew what mattered, and it was, image. So, yeah.
We're talking Vogue here. We're talking Vogue, Liam. Front cover.
Yeah. Do you know what? You're spot on, and I think it helps that Frederick Douglass, he's a good-looking guy.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Not only can he talk a good game, but he's pleasing to look at as well.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
19th century equivalent of social media influencer for sure.
You're veering into objectification of black masculinity there, Liam.
That's another episode, I think.
You can't say it.
Yeah.
By the way,
but I think we've probably only really just started that conversation around Frederick Douglass and his life, and we haven't even really explored that later career that he had in politics. We've sort of just touched on it, and I do think that's something we're going to have to revisit and talk about a lot more. That and more detail about his enslaved experience, and also the sort of the journey of escaping and that journey that slaves went on to get their freedom, as you say, was very deliberately vague in Douglass's autobiography, but I think is something that we probably need to explore on this podcast, because I think it deserves time. And another thing that you mentioned, Tony, about exploring the history of Frederick Douglass is also exploring the roots of African American slaves, because I do think too often when we look at African American history, we focus on the American part. We don't necessarily focus on the African part, and I think that's a very interesting tidbit to leave people thinking about. But to sort of close off our very, very brief discussion, I'd really like to ask you, Tony, what do you think that the sort of the enduring legacy of Frederick Douglass is?
There's so much, and I don't know. I mean, it's a big question. I received I don't know. I think there's one quote that always seems to not just come back to me, but it kind of resonates quite deeply within me. That I think Douglass said this quite late in his life, that education means emancipation, and that was critical for me as a youngster, as a young guy growing up in the north of England, as a student at UEA, and it continues to be the thing today that there's no substitute from just knowing stuff. It just means that there's a better chance you're going to be able to figure your way through something, or figure yourself away from something. He's not a figure I feel comfortable trying to reduce to one thing. But I think that notion, that concept of of education meaning emancipation, just holds so much. And just on that note, only a year or so ago, I came across the work of a young researcher in Britain called Hannah Rose Murray, who's done this amazing map charting Frederick Douglass's time in Britain. But she's also expanded to pinpoint and map the journeys of other abolitionist orators and speakers and activists. So, I mean, her work is really important, I think, because it's, you'll be looking at a map of England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales, and there'll be hundreds of little pins on there, and you can just click on those and it will tell you who was speaking when. It's a map that is just going to get fuller and fuller and more populated as more information comes forward. But again, it's still in that realm of education means emancipation.
This episode of America, a History Podcast, was produced, edited and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to our guests this week, Dr. Rebecca Fraser and, of course, Tony Phillips. And if you enjoyed this episode, do check out some of the extra resources that we've put in the show notes. And as always, a lot of work goes into this podcast, so if you can leave us a rating and review wherever you're listening, that would be amazing. Next time, we take a closer look at Black Lives Matter, what it is, and why it became so problematic in America.